Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everybody, this is lesson 2 in Backgrounds to the English Romantic 1798 to 1832. We'll be continuing to explore publishing, literacy and reading in the second part of this lesson, and specifically focus on literacy, reading and the audience. Let me begin with a famous Byron quote. I will publish, right or wrong, fools are my theme, let satire be my song. This is Byron making a case of the author's right to publish, no matter that he receives unfavorable reviews, no matter that he is panned by common readers or the elite critics. It must be noted that the explosion of radical publications is intimately linked to the political dissent, rebellions and protests in the period 1790 to 1830. Richard Altick's classic work on the social history of the English reading public, The English Common Reader, puts it beautifully. I quote, "In the turbulence of the 1790s, the emergence of a reading public among the humble brought England face to face with a major social problem, a problem destined to be shadowed for several decades by the threat, real or imaginary, of a revived Jacobinism. Tom Paine and Hannah More between them had opened the book to the English Common Reader, but was it merely a book or a Pandora's box of infinite trouble? If we were to think about the Romantic authors in terms of their reading public, we can follow Jerome McGann's 1993 work fruitfully. McGann detects two major strands within the Romantic tradition. One strand belongs to Blake, Byron and Shelley, whose work explicitly sought to convince and persuade an existing audience, convince them for instance about the tyranny of the present garment. The second strand belongs to Wordsworth, Coleridge and Shelley, where they had to create their own audiences by showing a different world. In short, what we are looking at is the making of public taste. Authors like Wordsworth were worried about how they would be read. You will recall this is what we said at the conclusion of lesson 1. Hence attempts such as the preface to the lyrical ballads. Here is Wordsworth in his famous preface. Please look at the first slide. This is Wordsworth explaining in a rather extended description what is meant by the word poet. What is a poet? And his key question, to whom does he address himself? That is, to whom does the poet address himself? What is the language to be expected from him? Then comes Wordsworth's famous definition. A poet is a man speaking to men. Then he defines it, he qualifies it. A man, it is true, endued with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. Please note, he has said he is a man speaking to men, but he is not an ordinary man. The poet is not an ordinary man. The poet, as you can see, has more sensibility, more enthusiasm, tenderness, greater knowledge, and so on and so forth. These are qualities manifest only among the poets. Wordsworth will go on for some time about this, about the structure of his mind and so on and so forth. But after that, he pays attention to the nature of the audience, and those are your next two slides. He says, as a defense of the kinds of poetry appearing in the lyrical ballads 1798, that low and rustic life, and I'm quoting from the preface, low and rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain maturity. They are less under restraint and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. What he's saying is, and let's get back to the quote, in that condition the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. Wordsworth is saying that it is in the rustic human beings that true passions are to be found. But can we take that language as it is? Can we use the language of the rustic farmer, the yeoman, the dairy maid as it is? No. Wordsworth qualifies this very carefully. The language of these men is adopted, and then he puts in a very important parenthesis. Purified indeed from what appear to be its real defects, from all lasting and rational causes of dislike or disgust. It's something you have to pay some attention to. He is not saying you can take the language as it is. He's saying this language has to be suitably modified. It has to be adopted, but it's also to be adapted. Wordsworth is not simply saying that the poet appropriates the language of the common man and puts it into the poetry. No. The common man, the farmer, the rustic laborer is important, but it may not be completely adequate to the task of poetic creation. So it has to be modified, and that can be done by the poet alone. Moving on from here to the question of how Wordsworth defines poetry itself. Famously, the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions, as the oft quoted description goes. But that is not all that Wordsworth says. Move on to the next two slides in which he defines poetry itself. This is what he says. Wordsworth saying, I have said that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Then comes a crucial clause. The emotion is contemplated till, by a species of reaction, the tranquility gradually disappears, and an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced, and itself does exist in the mind. What is Wordsworth doing here? Wordsworth first begins by talking about emotions and then uses the word contemplation to suggest that you can't really separate the two in the act of poetic creation. And in your next slide, you will see how he is showing, defending the kind of poetry being produced. He says he prefers to use a different claim, and that what is found in the volume, that is the lyrical ballads, about poetic diction. Why is Wordsworth going on about three things? The poet, the reader, and the language of poetry. Wordsworth is doing this because he is hoping to craft a new poetic diction, and he is worried that this poetic diction may not be acceptable. What he's saying is, you people, as in the readers, have been so used to a certain kind of poetry, a certain poetic diction, a certain style, that you will reject what we are trying to do. Wordsworth is talking about a poet as a trendsetter, but worrying that the trend may not ever become a trend. So therefore, this protracted, extended defense of what it means to write this kind of poetry. So preface to the lyrical ballads actually is a manifesto, as we all know, but it's also the expression of a cultural anxiety that he is trying out something new, Coleridge is trying out something new in lyrical ballads, and it may not be a successful attempt. Wordsworth is actually speculating, and let's have a quick summary here. He's speculating about the appropriate subject and language of poetry, the true, within quotes, nature of the poet, the language from which poetry, this kind of poetry, has to be sourced, the language of rustic England, which he says has to be modified, some modifications have to be undertaken, and the audience for the new poetry. The purpose, Wordsworth clearly indicates, is the fashioning of public taste, the making of an audience, the starting of new trends in poetry, but also in reading. So Wordsworth is anxious that the volume being marketed is likely to not have an audience at all, hence the elaborate defense. We normally think of preface to the lyrical ballads as a statement about a poetic manifesto. I am suggesting you also see it as an attempt to defend what they are doing, but also say to the audience, you be prepared for something new. In the 20th century, Ezra Pound would say, make it new. Wordsworth is anticipating that. But you see, the problem is when you try to make something new, people may not accept something new because they are used to something old. Now the point is whether the working classes read at all. What did they read? This project of investigating the reading habits of the Romantics is still being investigated. Duncan Wu's project on Wordsworth's reading itself is a huge one. What did Wordsworth himself read? Research since the 1990s has documented working class memoirs and autobiographies from the 1790s. These memoirs reveal the nature of working class reading. In any case, statesmen, publishers, magistrates, and the aristocracy, intellectuals as well, were all confirmed in the belief that public opinion, or indeed the public itself, was something to be carefully watched. Their fear was the public would be influenced by radical ideas. William St. Clair, in his path-breaking work, The Reading Nation in the Romantic Period, Cambridge University Press 2004, asks several questions that haunted England and its new readership. Please take a look at your next slide. 3 key questions. Can the newly formed readership be encouraged with reading as a liberation from ignorance, or to be treated as something dangerous? Question 2. Would a wider readership mean that there could develop a consensus within the nation, binding it together culturally? The role of reading as part of the building of nationhood, what in the 20th century Benedict Anderson would say, an imagined community brought together by print. William St. Clair is using that to talk about how the Romantic periodical and print publication may have created a sense of English identity. Question 3. Would reading destabilize established beliefs, leading them to anarchy or revolution? The elite were less worried about the newspapers than by books and materials, especially pamphlets. The consolidation of print capitalism collaborated with post-Napoleonic consolidation of British imperial identity. Karen Fang, in her lovely book Romantic Writing and the Empire of Science, Periodical Culture and Post-Napoleonic Authorship, makes this case. Karen Fang notes that Charles Lamb's famous Elia essays were first published in the London Magazine and can be linked to the history of porcelain trade. Lucy Newlin's Reading, Writing and Romanticism, The Anxiety of Reception, has argued that there is an anxiety of reception in the English Romantics. We have already anticipated Newlin's argument when we spoke about Wordsworth. Newlin sees a certain authoritarian view of the audience in these texts and proposes that Coleridge's anxiety can be seen in the form of a tension between a certain contempt for the reading public on the one hand and a very high expectation of readerly competence on the other. By figuring the ideal reader in a rather passive role of a mesmerized wedding guest, the opening of the famous The Ancient Mariner, Coleridge was opening up the possibilities for a non-passive interpretation, the active reader. Wordsworth was troubled by the fact that the poet was becoming increasingly a public figure. In order to deal with this development, which produced quite a bit of anxiety, Wordsworth appealed to an audience of the future. Others, such as William Hazlitt, Newlin argues, sought to develop an aesthetic grounded in orality. So what exactly are we seeing here? What we are looking at here is a two-point system. One, the widening of literacy and the making of public taste. Two, the anxiety that the authors had about who was reading and how they were reading. So whether it's the Ancient Mariner poem or the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, people like Wordsworth and Coleridge were wondering whether the audience would read them correctly. In the 20th century, as you all know, people like Stanley Fish write about the authority of interpretive communities. Its antecedents lie in something like the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, where Wordsworth is saying, you people are used to a certain style of poetry. We are not doing that. We are doing something else. Please bear with us. Maybe you will acquire a taste for this. The second part, the second component of this edge was the worry that radical pamphlets would influence these people. Tom Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft, Hannah More, whose tracts and William Corbett's Political Register put together radical opinions, could also be influential in the sense people did not always read just poetry. People would have also read pamphlets, tracts, political treatises. In many of those, the questions asked would be questions of the status quo of the government, the role of the people, the question of monarchy, the question of rights. We will be looking at the question of rights and the problems of dissent and revolution in a later session. But for now, what you need to understand is the English Romantic writers, when we have traditionally looked at them, were focused on the author. I am recommending that you move this, you shift this perspective a little bit. The English Romantic writers were indeed obsessed with the role of the author, but they were equally obsessed with the questions of the audience and the questions of reading and reading practices. Thank you.